Have you ever wondered what would happen if, instead of casting out a demon, an exorcist became the victim himself? What if a priest, trained to fight evil, ended up possessed by what he swore to fight? I am Father Thomas Berry, and today I need to share something that challenges all beliefs, something that the Church itself is afraid to admit. Because the truth is that we don't always win, and I am living proof of that. The last time we met, I told a story about an exorcism gone wrong, a ritual that was supposed to free a tormented soul, but in the end opened the door to something much worse. The evil didn't go away. It found a new host, and that host was me. At first I tried to ignore the signs, the tiredness, the whispers at night, that feeling that something was watching me, even inside the church. I wanted to believe it was just a side effect of the spiritual battle I faced. But then the changes began. Small at first, almost imperceptible. Strange thoughts invaded my mind. Words that I would never dare utter escaped my lips, and deep down, something inside me murmured, laughed, waited. Imagine the irony. I, a priest, an experienced exorcist, trained to recognize and combat evil, unable to realize that it was taking root within me. The more I prayed, the more distant God seemed. The more I fought, the weaker I became. But the worst was yet to come. Because there is something no one says about possession. It doesn't happen all at once. It infiltrates, spreads, corrupts little by little. And when you realize it, it's no longer the same. And then the moment comes when you need to face the truth. You are not alone inside your own body. And it was at that moment that I knew something inside me wanted to take control. What if a priest, the one who was supposed to drive out evil, became the real possessed? Imagine looking into the eyes of an exorcist and realizing that instead of being the hunter, he has become the prey. That something inside him, something dark and old, took control. You've heard of failed exorcisms. You know that there are forces that challenge even the most steadfast faith. But what happens when these forces stop attacking the victim and find a breach in the soul of the priest himself? In the last video, I told you about the terrifying spiritual consequences of an exorcism that didn't go as expected. But what I have not yet revealed is what happens when evil is not banished, but relocated. When a priest not only witnesses the demonic presence, but feels it within himself, eating away at his mind, tearing at his faith, whispering secrets no human should hear. This is the truth that few dare to tell. The truth about the moment an exorcist realizes he himself has become the battlefield. Have you ever seen something this strong happen? If so, leave your comment below, because what I'm about to reveal will forever change the way you see the spiritual world. There are things that the Church teaches us. Doctrines about the power of good and evil, about the eternal struggle between God and the enemy. But there are truths that are unspoken, experiences that go beyond the pages of Scripture and become flesh, blood, fear. When a priest stands before absolute evil, when he faces an entity that does not fear the cross, that does not back down from prayers, something changes within him. And this change could be forever. Most people believe that an exorcism follows a clear script. A priest approaches, recites the sacred words, lays hands, and the demon is forced out. But the reality is quite different. Sometimes the entity is not expelled. Sometimes she just switches bodies. Sometimes it chooses a new host. And what happens when this host is precisely the one who should be the barrier between the world of men and the abyss of hell? I always believed that my faith was strong enough. I studied the rituals. I knew every prayer. I carried the name of Christ on my lips like a sword. But that day, that exorcism, something slipped out of my control. The moment the young woman's body fell to the floor, inert, and silence filled the room, I knew. The demon had not been defeated. He had just found a new home. The first sign was subtle, a strange feeling on the back of my neck, as if someone was whispering without a sound, an echo of words I couldn't understand. Then came the dreams, Images of writhing shadows, faces that dissolved in the dark, voices that called my name. I woke up sweating, my body heavy, my mind foggy, as if something was feeding on my own energy. Then the memory lapses began, little moments that disappeared like smoke. One moment I was praying, the next I was standing in the middle of my room not knowing how I got there. The prayers began to sound strange in my mouth, as if the words were not welcome, as if my tongue burned when pronouncing the name of God. At first, I tried to deny it. I told myself it was just tiredness, the weight of years of dealing with forces no man should face alone. But then the signs became clearer. The sacred images in my room began to bother me. The smell of incense made me nauseous. And, worst of all, I started hearing the voice. Not coming from outside, but from inside me. She didn't scream, she didn't whisper threats. She was calm, cold, patient, and she knew me. I knew every doubt I ever had, every fear I tried to hide. I knew where my faith was strong and where it was weak, and it nestled in these weaknesses, infiltrated my soul like poison. The other priests began to notice my change. I avoided looking them in the eye. I felt an inexplicable discomfort in their presence. Masses became difficult to bear. The altar seemed farther away, the cross heavier. It was as if something inside me was resisting, as if there was a second thought, a second consciousness fighting against every gesture, every prayer, every act of devotion. But the moment I realized something truly terrible was happening was when I found myself smiling in the middle of a confession, a cold smile for no reason, a smile that wasn't mine. The believer in front of me noticed. He backed away, scared, muttered something about feeling a chill, a strange cold in the room. And me, I didn't feel anything, nothing but a vacuum, a black hole growing inside me. Each day, the presence within me became stronger. She whispered not only during the night, but also during the day. He tried to negotiate, bargain, make me doubt. I started to question things that were previously unquestionable. Who was I? Who was really in control? But the scariest thing was when I started seeing reflections that didn't match my movements. In the mirror, in the church glass, in the holy water, small delays, a sparkle in the eyes that wasn't mine. And then, one day, he spoke. Not in my mind, not as an intrusive thought, but through my own mouth. What did he say? This is something I'm not ready to reveal yet. But what I can say is that, at that moment, I realized that it was no longer just me in there. Something else lived in my body, something that couldn't be expelled with a simple prayer, something I didn't want to leave. And now, the real fight was just beginning. It was at that moment that I understood the unthinkable. The exorcism had not freed the young girl. It had only relocated the entity. She did not disappear. She did not return to the abyss from which she came. Found a new host. And that host was me. For years, I believed that faith was an unbreakable shield, an impenetrable barrier against the forces of darkness. But in that moment, standing in front of the mirror, staring at my own reflected eyes that seemed to belong to something else, I realized that everything I knew about possession was wrong. What happens when the one who should cast out the devil becomes the gateway for him? How do you get rid of something that is already inside you, feeding on your soul, growing stronger with every doubt, with every weakness, with every little crack in your faith? In the first few days, I tried to find logical explanations. The exhaustion, the trauma of the exorcism, the pressure of responsibility. But as the days went by, the signs became increasingly difficult to ignore. I felt a constant presence, as if a shadow accompanied me all the time, even when I was alone. It wasn't just a psychological burden, it was a physical thing. The air felt denser, more charged, as if I were trapped in an atmosphere that did not belong to this world. And then the voices started. At first, they were whispers at the edge of perception, incomprehensible words that seemed to emerge from the silence itself. But over time, they became clearer. They didn't come from outside. They didn't echo through the church halls or hide in the dark corners of my room. They were inside me, rooted in my thoughts, distorting my own inner voice. The worst part was not hearing them. The worst thing was realizing that, little by little, I started to answer them. I started to doubt myself. Prayers that once flowed naturally now required effort. Some words just refused to come out of my mouth. It was as if there was a force blocking every attempt to invoke the sacred. And then came the lapses. I found myself in places without remembering how I got there. Sometimes I would find unlit candles on the floor of my room, marks on the walls that I didn't remember making. One night, I woke up at the church altar, alone, holding a broken crucifix in my hands. Fear started to take over me, not fear of an external attack, of an evil spirit lurking around me, but fear of what I could do myself. The devil did not manifest himself in the traditional way. There were no violent convulsions, no words in ancient languages escaping my lips against my will. No, the possession was subtle. It infiltrated my thoughts, shaped my actions, made me vulnerable. It was an invisible war, and the battle was fought inside me. The other priests began to notice my change. Concerned looks, questions disguised as concern. "Are you okay, Thomas? He looks tired." I replied that it was just the weight of the routine, the spiritual wear and tear of my mission. But deep down, I knew. I saw the fear in their eyes. They knew something was wrong. I tried to get help myself, but how does an exorcist confess that he is possessed? How can we admit that someone who should be a warrior of faith now carries within himself the very evil he swore to fight? If I told the truth, if I told them what was happening, what would they do to me? Would they arrest me? Would they keep me from the church? Would they attempt an exorcism? The idea of an exorcism terrified me more than anything else, because deep down, I knew. If the ritual was performed, the demon was not guaranteed to go away. I felt like he was rooted in a different way, that his presence was more than just a parasite that could be expelled. What if he didn't leave? What if, in the middle of the exorcism, I was the one who disappeared? The line between who I was and what lived inside me was becoming increasingly blurred. There were times when I felt an inexplicable desire to do things that went against everything I believed in. Thoughts that weren't mine, an impulse to break the cross on the altar, to blow out the candles in the chapel, to laugh during prayers. I fought it, but the fight was exhausting. What happens when an exorcist becomes a battlefield? When your own mind, no longer belongs to you completely? Then the worst came. The moment I feared from the first whisper, from the first distorted reflection in the mirror, the moment I realized I was no longer in control. One night, while praying in my room, I felt an overwhelming presence surrounding me. It was unlike anything I had ever faced, an unbearable weight, a dense, suffocating darkness. My hands shook over the rosary, my vision became blurred, and then everything went silent. An absolute silence, and in the midst of this emptiness, I heard my own voice. But I wasn't the one who spoke. It was at that moment that I understood that possession was not a distant threat. It was not something I could ignore or fight with simple prayers. The devil was there, inside me, and he was waiting for the right moment to take complete control. The question now was no longer whether I could expel him. The question was, who would win this battle? Me or him? The nights were no longer the same. Sleep, once restorative, had become a silent battlefield. I closed my eyes and instead of rest, I sank into a limbo of disturbing images and suffocating sensations. Dreams that seemed more real than they should have been. Dreams in which I saw myself, but not as I am. My face distorted, my eyes empty, my voice speaking words I didn't recognize. I always woke up the same way, sweating with my heart racing, unable to remember if I had slept for minutes or hours. And then the whispers started. At first, it was a faint noise, a distant sound that could be mistaken for the wind passing through the cracks in the church windows or the creak of the old wood in the confessional. But over time, it became clearer. more insistent, disjointed words, phrases murmured by voices I couldn't identify. Sometimes they called my name. Others laughed softly, mockingly, as if they already knew something that I was still trying to understand. I knew I was not alone, even when I found myself inside the church before. The altar, surrounded by the sacred symbols that were supposed to protect me, I felt a constant weight on me, an invisible presence that wouldn't leave me. I walked through the corridors of the temple and had the distinct impression that eyes were following me, watching me, even when there was no one else there. It was as if a shadow was always by my side, silent, patient, waiting. The worst thing of all was that this feeling didn't leave me even when I was surrounded by other priests. During masses, I noticed quick glances in my direction, hesitant smiles, barely concealed gestures of concern. Deep down, I knew what they were thinking. They saw the change. They felt the difference. Something about me wasn't the same anymore. I could hear it in the subtlest details, in the trembling hands as I held the holy cup, in the way my voice sometimes wavered as I recited scripture, in the growing discomfort that came over me whenever I heard the name of Christ spoken. But what terrified me more than anything was that I began to feel another type of thought forming inside me. It wasn't just the whispers, the distant voices, or the feeling of being watched. They were the impulses, an almost uncontrollable desire to do things I would never do. The desire to blow out the altar candles in the middle of Mass, to interrupt prayers with laughter, to turn the cross upside down. Small things, insignificant to anyone looking from the outside. But inside me, I felt like each thought like that was a crack, a sign that something was taking space inside my mind. And then came the lapses, moments when I simply disappeared from myself. Time was bent, becoming inconsistent. One moment I was kneeling in prayer, the next I found myself standing in front of the sacristy door without remembering how I got there. Sometimes I realized I had said things I didn't remember thinking, little sentences, little comments that sounded wrong in my own voice. Something inside me was trying to manifest, trying to emerge, and I was fighting to maintain control, but control was slipping through my fingers. One night, while praying alone at the altar, I felt something different. The environment around me became colder, and it wasn't just the temperature. It was a coldness that came from within, that seemed to emanate from the ground itself. The silence in the church became deafening, as if the entire world had suddenly gone silent. My body was still, but inside, I felt something stirring, something that wasn't natural. When I opened my eyes, I saw my reflection in the glass of the reliquary, and in that reflection, my eyes weren't mine. That was the moment I knew I was no longer just being watched. Something inside me was looking back. For days, I tried to convince myself that this was all just exhaustion. After all, what else could it be? The weight of the routine, the countless visits to the faithful, the sleepless nights, the worries that a priest carries in silence. That was it. It could only be that. Nothing but my mind playing tricks, exhausted by the pressures of faith and the spiritual wear and tear of dealing with evil for so long. It was easier to believe this explanation than to face the truth that crept into every shadow, every whisper, every lapse of memory that made me doubt myself. But then, if it was just tiredness, why couldn't I pray anymore without feeling the air around me become heavy? Why did the words of Scripture seem to jumble in my mouth, as if they were forbidden to me? Why, when I looked in the mirror, did the feeling of being watched not come from outside, but from within? Fear began to take over me in a subtle, creeping way, like an invisible presence that hid in the corners of my mind, waiting for the right moment to reveal itself. I tried to ignore it. I tried to continue with the routine, but with each passing day, something inside me seemed to move a little further away from the light. The church environment, once welcoming, became oppressive. The altar, which used to give me comfort, started to seem distant, unattainable. That's when I decided to seek help. First, I talked to other priests, ministry colleagues who had known me for years. I explained my restlessness, my recent difficulties, the restless nights, the prayers that seemed to lose their strength. They listened attentively, but their responses were always the same, an invitation to introspection, reflection, renewal of faith. All priests go through moments like this, Thomas, they said. The spiritual battle is real, but God never abandons us. I wanted to believe them. I wanted to accept that all of this was nothing more than a personal crisis, an ordeal that every exorcist faces at some point in their life. But deep down, I knew this was different. That's when I sought out an experienced exorcist, a man who had faced demons that defied human understanding. He received me calmly, observing me with attentive eyes, as if trying to see beyond my skin, beyond my flesh. I asked direct questions. He responded prudently. He heard me describe the signs, the whispers, the time lapses, the feeling of being watched even when I was alone. There are no clear signs of possession, he said, his tone neutral. But I saw it. I saw in his eyes the hesitation, the doubt that he didn't want to express in words. It was then that he suggested that I carry out the tests myself. Father Thomas, if there is something within you, if there is an evil influence in your soul, the truth will reveal itself in direct confrontation. I followed your advice. I took a bottle of holy water and, alone in my room, decided to take the test. I held the bottle firmly, recited a silent prayer, and without hesitation let the water run over my skin. What I felt at that moment, I will never be able to fully describe. There was no pain, there was no visible burn, no marks on my skin, but something inside me receded. It was an instant, a split second, a deep instinctive feeling of revulsion, as if something inside me didn't want that contact, as if there was a hidden presence that writhed silently as it felt the purity of that sacred liquid. I tried to ignore it. I tried to tell myself it was just a suggestion, that my mind was playing tricks on me. But that night, when I finally managed to sleep, the dreams were different. This time, it wasn't just shadows. This time, I saw it. In the nightmare, I was in front of the altar, but the church was empty, immersed in a profound silence. The candles flickered, casting distorted shadows across the walls. I looked at the crucifix above the altar and felt a shiver run down my spine. Something was wrong, and then I heard my own voice. But I wasn't the one speaking. The voice came from behind me, low, drawn out, filled with something that didn't belong to this world. Why do you resist, Father? I turned around reflexively, but there was no one there, just darkness. My heart was beating wildly. The presence approached, invisible but tangible. I knew something was there, something that knew me, that knew every fear, every weakness, every moment of doubt I had ever had. I tried to move, but my body wouldn't respond. The air became heavy, as if the very atmosphere around me was compressing. And then I saw it. At the back of the church, a figure stood in the dim light. I couldn't see her face, but I knew she was watching me. You are already mine. I woke up with a choked scream, my body covered in cold sweat. It was no longer possible to deny it. Something was inside me, something that hadn't completely taken hold yet. I needed to act. I needed to find a way to stop it from progressing, from taking complete control. But how do you fight an enemy when he is already inside you? If this topic intrigued you, it's because almost no one talks about it. Your like shows that this kind of truth needs to be told. This way, we can bring more reports that the church prefers to keep silent. That night, something changed. Something broke inside me. It was no longer a vague sensation, a subtle discomfort, a growing suspicion. Now, it was an absolute presence, a force that was no longer hidden. It was there, real, pulsating, alive inside me. I was no longer just a man fighting his own thoughts. I was a battlefield. I tried to ignore it. I tried to follow the routine as if nothing was happening. But the routine no longer existed. Normality no longer existed. The morning after the nightmare, I went to pray as I did every day. I knelt before the altar, closed my eyes, and began to murmur the sacred words that had so often left my lips without hesitation. But this time, they didn't come. It wasn't forgetfulness. It wasn't a mental block. It was something different. A resistance, an invisible barrier that seemed to emerge from the inside out, as if each word were an unbearable weight on my tongue. As if, when I said them, something inside me writhed in pain. I tried to force it. Prayer could not be denied, could not be torn away from me. Our Father, who art in heaven. My voice cracked. My chest tightened. An icy shiver ran down my spine. Father, our... And then I felt the pain. It started as pressure in my chest, as if an invisible hand was trying to crush my lungs. A strange heat rose up my neck, a burning that was not physical but spiritual, a repulsion that came from within me, as if each word was tearing at something hidden in the depths of my soul. My fingers tightened on the arms of the bench. I took a deep breath and tried to continue. Hallowed be your name. And then the voice came, low, dry, cold. Wake up. My body froze. The silence around me became absolute. The air felt as heavy as lead. The altar before me, which had so often been a refuge, now seemed distant, unreachable. I opened my eyes, and for a second I saw something there. Not at the altar, not in the stained glass windows, not in the darkness of the church, but in the reflection of the silver blade of the holy chalice. Someone was there, not a full face, not a defined shape, just a shadow, a wicked glow where my eyes should be. I jerked away suddenly, knocking the bench over behind me. My hands were shaking. My heart felt like it wanted to escape my chest. But the worst was yet to come. I stood up, panting, trying to compose myself. The cross before me hanging over the altar looked wrong. Not because of its shape, not because of its size, but for the way it made me feel. I should feel protected looking at her. I should feel peace, comfort, the certainty that God was with me. But no, what I felt was nausea. A wave of uneasiness washed over me. My eyes burned, my hands were shaking. A knot formed in my stomach. It was as if that cross no longer belonged to me, as if I no longer belonged to her. I tried to get closer, but with each step, the discomfort increased. My body felt heavier, as if an invisible force was pulling me. Back my knees weakened, and then the voice came again. No, you can't anymore. The voice did not come from outside. It didn't echo through the church halls. It didn't whisper from the top of the altar. It came from within, from inside me. My own chest vibrated with those words. My throat burned like it was being used by something that wasn't mine. My mind was torn between terror and disbelief. I wanted to fight. I wanted to get closer. I wanted to touch the cross, but I couldn't. At that moment, I understood. The faith that had sustained me all my life, that had strengthened me against the darkness, that had given me the courage to face the worst horrors, was now breaking. Something inside me was cracking, eating away at my essence, contaminating my soul. And for the first time I asked myself, what if it was already too late? My mind was in pieces. My body no longer belonged to me. Every time I tried to pray, every time I tried to hold on to the faith that had always guided me, I felt an abyss growing inside me. It wasn't just emptiness, it wasn't just doubt. It was something alive, something pulsing, something that grew stronger with every second I hesitated. The voice inside me was no longer just a whisper. Now she laughed. I heard it at the most unexpected moments, interrupting my thoughts, echoing in the darkness of my room, mixing with the silence of the church. She knew when I was vulnerable. He knew when I tried to resist. And worse than that, he knew how to break me. Do you think he still hears you, Father? The words appeared like invisible daggers, cutting into my sanity little by little. How many times have you called him? And how many times has he answered you? I tried to ignore it. I tried to fight. But fighting something that's already inside you, it's like trying to peel off your own skin. One night, as I walked down the aisles of the church, I felt an intense cold run down my spine. The environment was strange, as if the air itself was heavy, dense, loaded with something that my eyes couldn't see. The candles in the candelabra flickered, casting distorted shadows across the walls. The silence was absolute. That's when it happened. I had my back to the altar when I heard a dry sound, a dull thud behind me. I turned around slowly, my heart hammering in my chest. The crucifix that stood on the altar, the same one that had caused me so much nausea days before, was now on the floor, fallen. I took a hesitant step forward, cold, sweat running down the back of my neck. And then, before I could react, another sound filled the church. The sacred images around me began to fall, one by one. First, the small painting of the Virgin Mary that was near the sacristy. Then, the statue of Saint Michael the Archangel, which collapsed from its stone base, cracking the ground. The seats shook, a subtle tremor that made my heart freeze. The air became thick, almost unbreathable. And then, I felt it, something holding me back. Not physically. They were not hands of flesh and blood. It was as if an invisible shadow had curled around my chest, squeezing, crushing, robbing me of any control I still thought I had. My mouth opened, but I wasn't the one who spoke. I am here, my own voice, but distorted, dragged, loaded with something that didn't belong to this world. I tried to close my mouth, tried to regain control, but it was as if my tongue no longer obeyed me. I never left. The words came out without me wanting them. My throat burned. My head throbbed. It was like I was trapped inside my own body, watching helplessly as something else took control. My knees gave way. I fell to the floor, shaking, trying to stifle the voice that wasn't mine. He abandoned you. The words echoed through the empty church, and in that moment, I felt it. The absence of God. All my life, faith had been my strength. Even in the darkest moments, even in the face of the most terrifying forces, I always knew I was not alone. I always knew there was a presence by my side, guiding me, protecting me. But there, kneeling on the cold floor of the church with that invisible force holding me, suffocating me, I didn't feel anything anymore. It was as if an invisible barrier had risen between me and the sacred, as if something had ripped me from the divine embrace and thrown me into an infinite void. I tried to pray. I tried to call on the name of Christ, but the words didn't come, and the laughter inside me only increased. The cold floor of the church seemed to swallow me. My body was motionless, muscles rigid as stone, but inside, a storm was raging uncontrollably. I felt the presence inside me laughing, triumphant, pleased with my despair. Never in all my years of dealing with possessions had I felt anything like this. The enemy was not in front of me, was not hidden in a helpless victim. He was inside my own body. I was no longer the exorcist. I was the possessed one. The laughter continued, echoing in the deepest corners of my mind, mixing with thoughts that weren't mine, phrases that I would never dare say, doubts that I had never allowed to grow. He knew me. He knew exactly where to attack. Do you really believe you can get rid of me? The voice reverberated inside my skull, as if my own vocal cords were just an instrument he manipulated deftly. I wanted to fight. I needed to fight. But how do you face an enemy who has already taken over your own reflection? How do you exorcise yourself? The thought hit me like lightning. The exorcism, the rite that I knew by heart, the sacred words that I spoke so many times, the divine strength that I so often invoked to free others. Would it be enough to free me too? But how? Who would perform the ritual? If I went to the church and told the truth, if I confessed that the entity I had fought for so long was now inside me, what would they do to me? Exorcists have always been trained to recognize the signs, but an exorcist being the target himself. This was something rare, something I had never seen myself. The options before me were stark. If I spoke, they could isolate me, consider me unstable, a danger to the faithful. Or worse, they might not believe it. I found myself faced with an impossible dilemma. If I did nothing, I would lose control. Little by little, Every part of me would be erased, replaced by this dark presence that was already testing me, bending me, fragmenting me. But if I sought help, what would happen? How to ask for help without looking like a crazy person? That's when I realized that the battle wasn't just against that force, it was against time itself. With each passing day, I felt the presence growing stronger. In the first few days, it was just whispers, impulses, strange sensations. Now there was something deeper. There were moments when I didn't recognize myself. I found myself mumbling words I didn't understand, in languages I had never studied. My handwriting started to change. Little notes left at random that I didn't remember writing, filled with symbols I didn't know. My dreams were no longer just nightmares. They were memories, but not mine. Visions of ancient times, of rituals that should never have been witnessed. And then came the moments of total darkness. Minutes, hours, entire swaths of my day would simply disappear. I would blink, and before I knew it, I was in another room, in another position, holding objects I didn't remember picking up. One night, I woke up on the floor of the sacristy, holding a piece of a broken crucifix. My fingers were raw, as if I had tried to crush him with my bare hands. I didn't remember doing that. But there was dried blood under my fingernails. I was losing. There was no choice anymore. If I hesitated, I would lose everything. I needed help, but asking for help meant admitting the unthinkable. I, Father Thomas Berry, exorcist trained to face evil, was possessed, and time to save myself was running out. The decision to seek help was not easy. I knew that by admitting what was happening, I ran the risk of being discredited, removed from the church, or worse, treated as someone who had completely lost their sanity. But I also knew I didn't have any more time. With each passing day, the presence within me grew stronger, taking small parts of me, corrupting my mind, erasing my faith. I could no longer trust my own thoughts. The process of finding someone who believed my story was tormenting. I couldn't just show up at the diocese and say, I need an exorcism. I am the possessed one. That would be spiritual suicide. No priest wants to admit that one of his own fell victim to what he swore to combat. But there was a man who could help me. Father Matteo was a veteran exorcist, one of the few who had faced possessions that defied the church's own rules. I knew that if there was anyone who could understand what was happening to me, it would be him. The problem was that I didn't know how he would react to. Hearing what I had to say, I arranged to meet him in a small chapel far from the city, a discreet place where we could talk without fear of being interrupted. When I arrived, I felt the weight of darkness on my shoulders, like never before. It was like something inside me knew I was about to expose him, that I was trying to fight back, and I didn't like it. Matteo looked at me carefully as soon as I entered. He noticed immediately. I didn't need to say a word. You took a long time to come, he said, his voice firm but without judgment. Those words hit me hard. He already knew. Somehow he knew. I sat down in front of him and told him everything. The whispers, the memory lapses, the repulsion for the sacred, the voices that spoke through my mouth, the feeling that God had abandoned me. He listened silently without interrupting. When I finished, he took a deep breath, closed his eyes for a moment, and then said, You understand what that means, don't you? I nodded, feeling a knot form in my stomach. The exorcism needs to be done, and it needs to be now. Those words chilled me inside. I knew there was no other way out, but hearing it from someone else made it so much more real. The ritual would have to be done in secret. If the church knew that one of its exorcists was possessed, the consequences would be unpredictable. Matteo prepared everything quickly. The chapel doors were locked, the windows covered, the space was purified with incense and holy water. The book of Roman ritual was opened on the altar, and I knelt before him, waiting. When Matteo began the prayers, I felt the first wave of resistance within me. It was as if something was shrinking, trying to hide. At first, it was just an inconvenience, a feeling of discomfort. But as he continued, something began to change. My body went rigid. My breathing quickened. An unbearable heat rose through my chest, as if liquid fire was being poured inside me. My hands started to shake. Then came the pain. It was as if something was being forcibly ripped from my soul. An invisible weight pressed against my chest, crushing my lungs. My vision became blurred, my ears were ringing, and then I listened. A scream, not an ordinary scream, not a sound any human could make. It was a roar of pure rage, a sound that seemed to tear apart reality itself. But it didn't come from outside. It came from inside me. I tried to speak. I tried to ask for help, but my mouth was no longer mine. My throat twisted against my will. Words began to fall from my lips in a language I didn't recognize, but which Matteo certainly understood. His eyes narrowed. "You can no longer hide," he said firmly. "The Lord casts you out." My body was thrown backwards with a force that wasn't mine. I felt my arms and legs locking up, every muscle in my body in involuntary spasms. My chest burned like it was being burned from the inside. The voice inside me roared again. "He doesn't listen to you anymore, Father. You are mine." It was always mine. The world around me was spinning. The ceiling of the chapel seemed distant. I felt a force trying to drag me into an indescribable void. Something inside me fought to stay, to not be ripped away. But Matteo didn't stop. "In the name of Christ, I command you, go away." The pain was unbearable, an agony that transcended the body, that reached directly the soul. The entity roared, struggled, but something began to change. A crack in the darkness. And then, in the midst of the pain, the chaos, the fight for my own spirit, I saw a light. And in that instant, I realized that the battle was far from over. This story needs to be told. If you believe that the unknown hides truths that few dare to face, share this story with someone who needs to know. What happened in that chapel could change the way we see the spiritual world. Are you ready to open that door? The light I saw in the final moment of the exorcism was not what I imagined. It was not a glorious revelation. It was not the divine touch restoring everything in a single breath of grace. It was just a glimpse, a fragment of something bigger, something that pulled me back to the surface, while a part of me still clung to the darkness. I felt the presence inside me being ripped away, feeling every inch of it fighting, clawing, trying to stay trapped where it no longer belonged. It was a silent battle in the final seconds, an invisible resistance that left me on the brink of collapse. And then, silence. My body fell to the floor of the chapel without strength. I heard my own breathing, heavy, uneven, as if I had just run for an eternity without rest. My heart hammered against my chest, and every fiber of my being trembled. But the darkness had dissipated. There was no victory. There was no immediate relief, just an emptiness. Matteo's face loomed above me, and his eyes, steady as they were, carried a weight I had never seen before. He didn't say anything right away, just waited. He waited for me to come to my senses, for me to find the right words to say what I felt. But how could I explain? How can anyone put into words what it's like to be touched by something so unholy, so corrosive, and still survive? I didn't know how long I lay there staring at the ceiling, trying to find any trace of the man I once was. But something inside me said, he no longer existed. He finished. My voice was scratchy, almost unrecognizable. Matteo hesitated. I saw the doubt in his eyes. "The possession is over," he said, but his voice was filled with something that made me shudder. "But you will never be the same." And I knew he was right. Over the next few days, the weight of the experience revealed itself in ways I never could have predicted. The church, which had once been my home, now felt like a strange, almost hostile space. Every corner, every shadow seemed to hide something I couldn't see. Even though the entity had been expelled, the echoes of its presence were still with me. My faith, it was strange to think about, but the truth was inescapable. My faith was in pieces. I spent my entire life believing in divine protection, in the unshakable strength of the church, in the absolute power of the cross. But now I knew there were loopholes. I knew that even those who devote their lives to God can be targets. And more than that, they can be dominated. I started to question everything. My vows, my purpose, my very existence as a priest. How could I continue preaching? How could I look into the eyes of someone seeking help and say, with the same conviction as before, that God would never abandon them? I had felt that abandonment. I had called out the name of Christ, and for a terrifying moment I felt no answer. I didn't sleep. The nights were filled with memories of the exorcism, with glimpses of something that should not be seen. I saw the face that had never been revealed, the face of what lived inside me, the hungry look, the crooked smile, the absolute certainty that he was never really far away. I started hearing the whispers again. At first, I thought it was paranoia, a side effect of the experience, something my traumatized mind created to punish me. But then, the objects started falling again. The lights flickered when I entered certain rooms, and the reflexes always seemed a second behind. I tried to ignore it. I was trying to tell myself that this was all a result of the trauma, that it was just a lingering memory of what happened, nothing more than the remnants of a possession that had already been cast out. But what if it wasn't? What if something had remained? Not the entity itself, but a piece of it, an invisible scar marked not on the body, but on the soul. What happens to a priest after being possessed? How can you continue celebrating Mass, holding the holy chalice, reciting the words of consecration, when there is something inside you that writhes at each one of them? I tried to continue. I tried to return to my duties, attend confessions, guide the faithful, but the looks, people felt it. They didn't know what it was. They couldn't put it into words, but they felt that something in me was different, and I knew it could never be the same again. Perhaps the entity was expelled, perhaps, but the mark she left, I don't know if it will ever disappear. The days following the exorcism were a blur. The world around me seemed to keep spinning, but I no longer felt part of it. The masses, the rites, the prayers, everything seemed distant, as if I were just repeating empty gestures without really being present. I tried to convince myself that this was normal. After everything I've been through, how could I just go back to the way I was before? How could I move forward without carrying the weight of what happened to me? I knew it was a miracle to be alive, that the evil that tried to consume me had been cast out. But if he had really been expelled, why? Did I still feel his presence in every dark corner, in every deep silence? I didn't want to sleep anymore. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw flashes of what happened. The exorcism, the screams, the pain. But there was something more, something my mind was trying to block out. There were images that I couldn't fully remember, but that crept into my consciousness at random moments. Faces I had never seen before, symbols I didn't know, words that echoed in the back of my mind, as if there was still a fragment of that entity trying to whisper to me, trying to call me back. The first nights were the worst. I would wake up with a tight chest, feeling like something was sitting on top of me, like an invisible weight was holding me to the bed. My limbs would go numb, and when I could move, the sensation would disappear as if it had never been there. But the worst part was the reflections. Mirrors became my enemies. I started avoiding them. Whenever I passed one, I felt a shiver run down my spine, as if something was there, something waiting for me to look. At first, I thought it was paranoia, but then I started to realize there was something wrong with what I saw reflected. Small details, a delay in my movement, a strange gleam in the eyes. Then it happened. One night, when I was exhausted and decided to face my own fears, I stopped in front of the mirror in my room. The chandelier next to me cast a flickering light, making the shadows more intense, deeper. I took a deep breath and faced my own image. My eyes were sunken, my skin pale. I was tired. But then my reflection smiled, and I didn't smile. The shock was so great that I took a step back, feeling my heart speed up. I blinked, trying to convince myself that it was just my mind playing tricks, but when I looked again, the reflection was still there, and the eyes that watched me were not mine. I tried to move, but my body felt paralyzed. The reflection tilted its head slightly as if analyzing me. And then, without moving my lips, I heard him. "Did you think it was over?" The sound came from inside my head, a familiar whisper, charged with the same presence I believed had been cast out. The chandelier light flickered. The room seemed to darken for an instant. My chest tightened, and I felt a wave of despair consume me. No, this couldn't be happening. The exorcism had worked. The entity had been banned. So, why was I still hearing your voice? I felt a shiver run down my spine as the reflection began to distort, not as a simple optical illusion, but as if reality itself was fragmenting inside that glass. And then he laughed, a low, slow laugh, filled with something that wasn't human. I didn't wait to see anything else. I picked up the crucifix that was on my table and pressed it with all my might, muttering a prayer that came tremblingly from my lips. I blinked again, and when I opened my eyes, my reflection had returned to normal. But I knew it hadn't been a trick of the mind. I knew something was wrong. Had the exorcism rid me of the entity, or just made me more vulnerable? The next morning I went to church to try to compose myself. Daylight made everything more real, more rational, but the feeling of restlessness was still there. The faithful passed by me, and no matter how much they tried to hide it, they saw something different. I could feel their gazes, could see the hesitation in their expressions. Some made the sign of the cross as they approached. Others simply looked away. But the worst was when a little boy who always came to Mass stopped in front of me, looked at me for a few seconds, and then asked, with the brutal innocence that only children have, "Father, why are your eyes different?" I didn't know what to answer. My heart froze. After all, what was left of me after that battle? If you want to know what happened to me after that, get ready. In the next video, I will reveal something that could change your view of good and evil forever. If you've made it this far, I need to know one thing. Do you believe that an exorcism can really expel all evil, or do you think that something always stays? Comment the word below, Mark, whether the experience of possession is believed to leave eternal scars, or release, if you think it's possible to completely get rid of something like this. I really want to know what you think about this. And if this story has stuck with you so far, don't forget to leave a like to strengthen the channel and help me bring more stories like this. If you're not already subscribed, press this red button and activate the bell, because in the next video, I'm going to reveal something that can completely change the way you see good and evil. Now, watch the next video that is appearing on the screen. But prepare yourself, because what I am going to tell you next is even more disturbing. See you there.